Hey, thanks so much for joining me today. I'm excited to jump on this call with you to talk about lease options simply explained. There's often a lot of confusion around lease options, rent to own. What exactly are they? And I want to boil it down to some very simple things today. So, first of all, you might be saying, well, what's the difference between a lease option and rent own? They're virtually the same thing. Rentone is a much more retail name, if you will, in terms of people who are looking to get into home ownership or other things like that. Understand the rent to own terminology from a really basic standpoint. Lease options is more the technical uh, uh, term that's used by professionals, if you will. So you might hear me going back and forth between lease options and rent own. Just know that it really means the same thing. So I get a lot of questions, how does rent own work? What are lease options? All that sort of stuff. So when I've got a tenant buyer, so a tenant who wants to purchase a home using my rent own program, I explain it simply like this. It's a program that we offer um, families and individuals who can afford mortgage payments, but they can't yet get qualified by a bank. And so typically what my customers do is they will put some money down, and then each month they'll pay the regular rent, and each month we'll credit them back a little bit of money from the rent, so that over a course of about 3 years, with their initial down payment that they put up plus what we're crediting them back each month, they've got now built up with us a deposit large enough for a down payment on a house. Now, during that time, we also help them fix or build or repair their credit scores so that they become mortgage ready. So that's essentially what a rent own is from a very basic standpoint for a tenant buyer. So I don't talk about lease options when I'm talking to a tenant buyer, but when I'm talking to other investors, I will talk about lease options, but it'll go back and forth like that. So what I wanted to draw an analogy to is a car. So you may have seen I posted recently about a car. So here's a sweet little ride here, and so what are all the ways that you can get this car, right? So let's just pretend with me that it is a real car, right? So you can purchase it outright. You can get a loan. You can do a lease on it. You can rent it. You could borrow it. You could steal it. You could buy it at the auction. There's so many different ways that you can pick up that car. And there's all good and bad reasons for each of them, especially the stealing one. Mostly bad on that, unless if it's a prank. So I want to talk about leasing a car today, right? So there's many reasons why you would and would not lease a car, and I'm not going to go into those tax reasons or financial reasons on that. I'm not going to say it's good or bad. I'm just going to say it is. We're going to talk about leasing a car. So when I talk about this car, basically what we're going to do is we're going to assume that this is a new car and it's worth $30,000 for today's example. So when you go into a dealership to lease a car, and you can do it privately, but it's more common. It's more retail known from dealerships. So you're going to go in there, you're going to pick the car that you like, and then you're going to obviously need to get qualified. And typically on a lease with a car, you put very little money down. $1,000. Some people will put 5,000 down. You can do whatever you want there. But then you're going to lease that car, let's say for 4 years. And today's value is, 30 grand plus taxes, and you're going to pay, $400 a month. So with that, you've gone into agreement, you're going to pay that for 4 years. And part of the lease says that after 4 years, you've got the option to purchase that car or to simply bring it back to the dealership and give them the keys, right? That's the option that you've got to buy it or just to turn it over and say, I'm done with it. So with that, the future purchase price on this liability, this is not an asset, this is liability because it depreciates, it goes down in value. So after 4 years, they're going to say you can buy it from us for 20 grand. And some stipulations are that you can only drive it X amount of kilometers or miles per year. You have to keep it in good shape, all that sort of stuff. Now, if you purchase it at the end, they don't really care about that stuff. But if you hand it back in at the end of the 4 years, okay, so if you hand it back in mint and it's under its agreed upon mileage that you're allowed to do, then you hand the keys in and you don't pay anything. Literally, don't pay anything. But if you hand it in and you've gone 20,000 kilometers over your agreed upon mileage, then you got to pay per kilometer on that. You got to pay them that because the car is now technically worth even less. If there's a bunch of dents on it or this and that or excessive wear and tear, they're going to charge you for that as well to leave the car with them. But if you purchase it after 4 years at the 20 grand and you go over by 20,000 kilometers and there's a bunch of dents, but you're buying it at that agreed upon price 4 years earlier, the dealership doesn't care what you've done to it. They're just happy that you're fulfilling that agreement. They're also happy if you don't take the option to purchase it. They're happy if you just hand it in and it's mint shape because they can now turn around and resell it to somebody else. Okay, so that's basically leasing a car. And I know there's a lot of minor or key details that I missed in there. And for those of you who have leased a car, you might say, what about this? What about that? I'm just talking about it from a broad perspective. So when I take one of my rental properties and I turn that into a rent and own for a tenant buyer, it's very similar. So they will put some money down and they will pay monthly rent. And they will agree that they will purchase the house, or they've got the option to purchase a house after 3 or 4 years at an agreed upon price. Now, the beauty of doing this is that it's not like this. When you've got a house, it's an asset. It generally increases in value. So you pick a future purchase price. So let's pick today's price at 300,000, and the future price is in 3 years is going to be 330. Simple. So they've agreed to that. Now, typically my tenant buyers will put down about $10,000 and they'll pay a little bit above market rents each month. And so I will credit them back, to $300 a month of their monthly rents and add it on to their 10,000, right? Each month. So that after 36 months, 3 years, they've got enough of a down payment now to go to the bank and then get that mortgage. Okay, I'm not talking about credit yet, but I'm just talking about the pure money aspect of it. So when they give my company the $10,000 and they sign all the agreements I've got with them, the option agreement says that the future purchase price is going to be 330. They've given me 10, and I'm going to credit them back $300 a month for the next 36 months, as long as those payments are on time. Also in the option, it'll talk about that they're responsible for repairs on the property. Sometimes it's all the repairs, sometimes it's up to $500 per instance. So when you think of a rental property, you get a plugged toilet. How much is that going to cost you to fix? You've got a burnt out element on the stove. The hot water tank goes, what are all these prices and what's your time worth if you're doing it personally or if you hire someone else to go out and do it? They all cost money. So what I try to do is I try to help my Rentone clients, my tenant buyers, think like a homeowner, and I make them responsible for all those minor repairs. So that does two things. It teaches them how to think like a homeowner. I give them a homeowner's manual. And secondly, it reduces my expenses dramatically, right? Because very easy to happen that 2, 3 months in a row you've got repairs that need to take place, and they're easily $300 each, sometimes more, right? So it eats up all your cash flow. So just like leasing the car, you're making I'm making the tenant buyer responsible for the repairs and regular maintenance. Now they've got the option in 3 years to purchase the house at 330, or they can walk away from the deal. But they've also agreed that they're going to keep the property in as good shape or better, right? We always try to encourage them to make improvements to the property. And, obviously, if it's major, permits have got to be pulled, all that sort of stuff. But, make the property your own, and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah, at the end of 3 years, they've got the option. During that time, we've given them direction on how to repair the credit. Often they're working with a mortgage specialist or their own bank to help repair their credit. And if they are ready at the end of 3 years to purchase the property, then they're ready to do so. And they buy it at the $330,000. We credit them back on paper their down payment, which is roughly 20,000 at that time, and they continue living in it, but now they become the owners. They've also got the option to walk away from the deal, and so much like the leasing of the car, they can walk away from it. Now, if there's excessive damage, more than regular wear and tear, then they've got to pay for that. So I'm starting to get into too much detail here, but I hope that so far you've got the idea of basically what a lease option is, what a rent to own is, right? So let me pause there for a second, and if you've got questions specifically about that, message me on any one of our channels that you're part of, and just ask for clarifying questions about how basically the lease option or rent to own works. Okay, so I've tried to explain it as simply as I can, and I hope that you were able to follow along. As I imagine the stuff in my mind's eye, I'm hoping that you're able to imagine that as well. But if you can ask questions and then you can come back and watch this again, that'll really help. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go a little bit deeper into this now, and I'm going to talk about, why do lease options, and there's so many different ways to do them, and that's probably where it gets confusing for a lot of people, is because they will see different people doing them in different ways, and it's very much like buying a car in many different ways. But because you've grown up around cars, most of you, or seen them, maybe you're in an urban setting or a very rural setting, whatever, you don't need a car or whatever, that's fine. But people will buy and sell them, people will flip them, people will wholesale them, they'll buy them from an auction, they'll lease them, they'll borrow them, they'll rent them, they'll co-op them. There's so many different ways. But because you've been around cars so much, that's really not that foreign. But how many homes have you bought in your lifetime, right? Maybe for some of you, none. Maybe for some of you, it's like you've been in your parents' home, or you've lived in a home, or you've rented. So you get a basic understanding, but you start throwing in some terminology and some different ways of doing the deals. You can see how it would get confusing. And that's where a lot of confusion happens, and people will say, when I explain some of my creative deals to people, they'll say, you can't do that. It's like, I'm doing it, and my lawyer is walking me through this. I'm structuring it this way. Just because it's not, everyday knowledge doesn't mean it can't be done, right? It's like, it's just because other people haven't experienced it, right, doesn't mean it can't be done. It's like saying, well, I don't know. I think you get the idea of what I'm saying there, is that it's kind of like, having a window that has that film on it, either dirty or it's got that film that makes it so you can't see through it, but the light will come through, right? And now you remove that film and you clean the window. It's like, hey, there's stuff out there I've never seen before, right? It's facing a different direction you've never looked out at, and you realize you can open that window. You stick your head out the window. It's like, holy smokes, there's a whole different world out here that I've never seen before. Now, does that make it not true? No, it's there. You've just never experienced it. And so, as you dive deeper into creative deals, into lease options and rent-owns and no money down deals, for some of you, it's going to feel very much like that. It's just like you're going to be blown away by information, and you're just going to recognize that there's so much out there. So be patient with yourself as you learn about this stuff. So for me as an investor, I love this strategy for many reasons, and I'll explain those many reasons towards the end of this video. But what I want to talk about now is, as an investor, the ways that I can do them. So I can take one of my existing properties that I got a traditional mortgage for, and I'm paying principal, interest, tax, insurance, right? Pity. And I'm paying for those utilities and expenses. And I've got a regular tenant in there, but I'm responsible for repairs. Now, I can now change that property over to a rent own for a client, where they come to me and they've got $10,000 to put down, and they're eventually going to own it in 3 years, right? So it's just a different exit strategy. So different exit strategies on that property I'm telling you about right now that I've already owned, right? So prior to me explaining this to you, if I just own it and I've got a tenant in it and it's working great, that's called a buy, rent, and hold, which many of you know of. It's a long-term buy, rent, and hold. I maybe don't make a lot of cash flow off it right now, but it's a wealth builder long-term. You hold on to your buy, rent, and holds for a longer period of time, ideally for the rest of your lives, and it starts to spew out much more cash down the road. So every investor needs buy, rent, and holds, whether that's a bunch of single-family homes, bunch of duplexes, triplexes, or owning an apartment block, all that sort of stuff. That's long-term wealth building, and all of us need those in our portfolios. But they don't necessarily spit off a lot of cash for us right now. And so going back to my example with the house, I can change the exit strategy of that from a buy, rent, and hold to a lease option or a rent own for a tenant buyer. So I hope that makes sense. I can also take that same house and I can do a lease option with another investor, right? So another investor might say, I want to grow my portfolio, but I can't get another mortgage right now. I've got 3 properties and I want another one, but the bank won't give me a mortgage. How can I do this, Cam? Okay, I've been in your spot. Why don't you rent on my property? And they're like, okay, well, what do you mean? It's like, well, you put some money down with me rather than the bank. And then, obviously we got to do the math. We got to make sure that you're going to be qualified to do this in a couple of years. But you can acquire another property, add it to your portfolio without physically qualifying for a mortgage. But you've got rights to that property through the paperwork that you sign with me. Okay, well, that sounds interesting. So what would I do with that property? Well, you can live in it if you want to, but probably you're not going to want to do that. So you can turn around and you can rent it to somebody else, right? Okay. So an investor comes to me, they're going to rent on one of my properties, and then they're going to turn around and rent it out to somebody else just as a regular tenant. Does that make sense? That's a pretty basic way to do it, and it's a very common way to do it. A lot of investors who don't really understand the finer details of doing lease options and rent owns will do that, but they'll set their tenant buyer up for failure. And so I caution you to not not just go out and do this with this basic information, because I can pretty much guarantee the deal is going to fail. And that's in part what gives Rentone a bad name, is because there's lots of people who have good intentions, but they set it up incorrectly, and a person loses not only their $10,000, but their monthly amount that they saved up over years. And then, they could go to the news and say, this landlord ripped me off, and then you get featured on the news, and that doesn't look good. Or they tell all their friends their bad story, and it's like, I heard Rentone's a ripoff and it's bad. It's like, well, yeah, when people set it up incorrectly, that's true. And there's a very small percentage of people who will intentionally set these up that way so that the tenant will fail just to make a quick buck. So that's not what I'm teaching here. I'm teaching a much more thorough approach to it that is to help people get into home ownership, help other investors grow their portfolios. So with that investor who's gonna do that, that sounds like a good opportunity for them, because they can't get any more mortgages. Okay, so let me pause there, and I'm gonna shift gears over here. This is one of the ways I love doing Rentones, is because you can do exactly what I said. The investor comes to me, someone who owns a house, and can take my property and make money off of it, and I'm still making money off it, right? That's what's called a win-win. And so that's what I did. So back in 2010, when I first started doing this, I started doing this exact approach, because I think I had 5 doors in my portfolio, and my bank said, no more. We're not going to lend you anymore. Plus, I was running low on deposits. So it's when I remembered that this strategy, that you can partner with other people who already own the homes, or you get people to buy homes for you, and you do what's called a sandwich lease. And a sandwich means that someone else owns the home. I and the investor come in, I do a partnership with them, say I'm going to look after the property, and then I'm going to turn around and form a partnership with somebody else who's going to rent it from me. So that's called a sandwich lease. And so I was able to duplicate that. In that next 5 years, I was able to set up 40 of those deals, 40 homes, all with different owners, all with different tenant buyer rent-own clients. And so for me, it was a great strategy, because, and it can be for you as well, and some of you who are watching this are already doing this. It's a great strategy because for me, they're essentially no money down deals. And I could generate cash flow from each of these properties. And I controlled these properties through my paperwork, which was legally binding. The way I set them up, and I give every investor a very small amount of money via a check, and I can explain that at a different time, to make it a legal binding agreement. So I now control the property. And in that scenario, from that run, from 2010 to 2015, I controlled 40 properties, generated cash flow from them each month, all with my paperwork and money, like $100 for each property. So I spent $4,000 to control 40 properties, which their full market value at the time was over $10 million a property. So you do the math on that. It's an average of, I think, 265 for property, right? So now those 40 would be in the neighborhood of 14 or 15 million. So, and that's just a ballpark off the top of my head. I haven't done the math on that. So yeah. So what's cool about this is that you've got these benefits of doing these properties. So what I did now is I took the idea of a lease option, of a rentone, and I explained it in very simple terms, compared it to a car, leasing a car, and then I applied it to a house that I already owned. And then I took that thread and I took it along a little bit further, and I explained how another investor could rent own one of my properties. And then I took that thread a little bit further and explained how I was that investor, and I um, worked with 40 other investors. That's not true, actually, because probably about 30 investors or 25, because a number of them owned multiple properties that I ended up doing this with. Excuse me, but I took that thread and I went down that avenue. So that is a very a very specific thread of how to do these deals. Now, to go a little bit deeper in that, there are many different ways that beyond what I've just explained to you, what you can do. And if you're familiar with my content, you know that I talk about two types of investors that I work with, right? I work with the working professional, someone who can afford to get another mortgage and has got the down payment, they've got the credit, so they've got, the ability to put down 25% of a property. And so that's the first type of investor, and they like the turnkey hands-free investment that my company offers. And this is not a pitch. I'm not trying to get investors through this. I'm just telling you the people I work with because the people you can work with. And the other type of investor I work with is what I call tired and frustrated landlords. People who own one property or 20 properties, and they're looking for an exit strategy that solves their headache. And their headache can be anything from, they just can't manage it anymore, or they are tired of dealing with tenants, or it won't sell on the open market, it doesn't show well, all these number of things. Those people are everywhere. And so I'm going to do another live video specifically just on tired and frustrated landlords, because it's an untapped market out there for deals like this. So other ways that I've done it, so there's going back to the Rentone model. There's tenant first, where you find a great tenant, and then you go out and purchase them a home. And then there's the other, which is house first, where you have a house, you pretty it up, and then you put a for rent sign out or advertise, and then you seek out a great tenant buyer. So those are the two ways that you can do that up front. Now, there's so many different ways that you can do these lease options, because what I've done is I've used my paperwork and used my same paperwork, but I just did a flip in the property, right? So you can do a flip where, for example, my latest one was with a tired and frustrated landlord. The house showed so poorly it stank. It was one of the stankiest homes I've ever been in. And he didn't know what to do, because put it on the open market, he would not have gotten what he needed to clear off his mortgage and taxes and stuff. So I came in, negotiated a deal with him to buy it off of him in, I think it was 7 months. And so I did, I paid him a monthly rent amount just to cover his expenses, not fair market rent. And then we agreed that I would buy it off of him in 7 months at a purchase price. So we did that, and so we controlled the property, and we secured our risk on it, and we put in $70,000 worth of renos, and then we turned around and we sold it on the open market. So what was great about that is that we didn't have to come up with a mortgage up front. We put very little money down with the tired and frustrated landlord to secure the property, and we used all of our funds that we had. Actually, I borrowed the funds, but we used those for the renovations on the property, made this house look killer, and we sold it on the open market for a profit. And so you might be asking, well, how did you sell it when you didn't own it? It's a good question. Thanks for asking that. Basically, it's called a double close. It's a function of the lawyer, or a simultaneous close. And I can go into deeper conversation about that, but it's done all the time. And so for me, the other ways that I've done it are, I've done similar to that, where I've secured the property with very little money down, and I did the renos, and then I put a tenant buyer into the property, right? And then I turned around and I sold the package to an investor, right? So that's a different way you can do it. And so I think for some of you who are experienced, you're wrapping your head around this, going, wow, that could really work in this one situation. And there's others of you, they're like, I have no clue what you're talking about, and that's okay. So if that's the case, ask the questions from the first 15 minutes of the video, and let's focus on that to get you understanding the real basics of it. But what you can see is that over time with experience, you can become a craftsman of this strategy, and you can do so many different things, and you can problem solve for people, right? Because often what happens is the deals I end up doing are deals that many other investors have passed over because they don't know how to structure the deal to make money, right? And so the more exit strategies you do understand, right, they're in your toolkit. The more exit strategies that you understand, the more likelihood you're going to make money and more of it, right? So when I was a newbie, my toolkit consisted of a buy, rent, and hold, where I put down, a down payment with the bank, and they gave me a traditional mortgage for it, and I put a renter in it, right? That's how most people start off. I started off that way by reading Rich Dad Poor Dad. I used his example of the condo that he had in Honolulu. I didn't buy a condo, but I used the basic profit and expenses idea. Profits got to exceed the expenses. I did the rough math. And so when I was looking for that house that fit those numbers, that's the only tool I could pull out of my toolkit, which really limits you after some time, because it really slows you down, because you'll come across deals that the bank won't even lend to you, right? A lot of these homes that smell like crap and look like crap, and you want to do a flip on it, banks won't lend you money for that. Traditional banks, anyways. Yeah, private financers will. But now when I look at a property, I'm immediately subconsciously scanning. Okay, what's my potential exit strategy on this? Is it a buy, rent, and hold? Is it a lease option? Is it a flip? Is it a wholesale? Is it a tear down and develop? And on and on. All those are different ways of deals that I've done over the years that are in my toolbox. And so, fortunately, the toolbox is always with me. It's in my mind, and I'm able to draw on that at any time to run quick math and run potential exit strategies and all that sort of stuff. So you can tell that I'm starting to get deeper and deeper into this. But the idea is that there's so many options to do this strategy with. Options, pun not intended. So the benefits for me that I see are that I can pick up homes for essentially no money down. I can partner with investors on these deals for essentially no money down. I can generate cash flow really out of nothing, out of thin air. So what I mean by that is I can take my ideas and I can find a property that isn't generating money or good money right now, and I can turn that property around to generate excellent cash flow, right? So typically when I'm doing these no money down deals, I'm making about 50% of the profit. The other partner, the owner on it, is making the other 50%. But when I can find a house and I can make 30, 40, maybe 50 grand off that house from an idea, and the investor is also making equivalent, that's pretty killer. Now, if I do this with one of my own homes, I can make more than that. And I won't go into detail how we get that. I mean, but for me, these are all the benefits, right? So I ended up quitting my day job after doing my first Rentone deal, no money down. I had an investor purchase the property for me, and I got $20,000 up front, and I got $200 cash flow for 5 years, and I made a bunch of money at the end when the tenant buyer qualified and now owns the property, right? So I looked at that and I thought, This is totally duplicatable. Why couldn't I do that again? Why couldn't I find, you know, like the couple who helped me do that deal, they they probably could do it again. They've got enough capital to do another one. But if they did it and they're loving it because they're not setting their foot on there and they're getting rent every month, why couldn't I find other investors to do that? And that's essentially what I did. For the next 12 months, I did 4 or 5 more just like that, all with different investors. And then into my second year of doing this full time, because I had some experience, my mind got a little bit more creative. And that's when I structured my first no money down deal with a tired and frustrated landlord, someone who already owned the property, and I basically took over the property. I took the headache off of their hands, and then I started generating cash flow from it. And then that owner essentially texted me and said, "Hey, I've got 4 more of these. Do you want to? Are you interested?" Like, yes, very interested. And that just kind of took off, and that's when I just kept on going. So I just covered a lot of information, and the basics of this talk here, this video, is lease options simply explained. So I hope that I've explained it simply enough for you that you can grasp it, that that window's a little clearer, or at least you've been able to crack the window open up and have a peek out to see what that looks like, because this is a life-changing strategy for me. I do other strategies. I do buy, rent, and holds. I do flips, wholesales. Majority of my time is with lease options. So please leave your comments. Was it helpful? Give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And if you give me a thumbs down, which is totally fine, tell me what I could have done better. I'd love to hear your comments. Thanks so much for taking the time to join with me today. Have a great day.